Hey folks, Dr. Mike Israetel here for Renaissance Periodization Strength Training Myths video number 5. You must train the assistance lifts to get better at the core lifts. Is the claim, is the myth? What's on the agenda for today? We're going to talk about the claim specifically. Kind of sounds like an odd claim, but I promise it has actually been made and written into books and videos. We're going to talk about how assistance lifts to the core lifts in strength actually do help. Then we're going to talk about situations in which assistance lifts are given a little bit too much credit. We're going to essentially expose their limitations. And then we're going to talk about what the best approach is, combining assistance lifts with core lifts to actually get as strong as possible on the core lifts which matter the most. So the claim is that, a lot of people say, the way to really, it's almost like they phrase this as kind of like a hack, like an unexpected discovery, something counterintuitive. They say, the real way to improve your core lifts, the real way to improve your deadlift is to not deadlift. All right. And people have legit made that claim before. So say, the way to boost your lifts is really via assistance work. Like, yeah, junior leaguers think like, I want to be a better bencher. I just bench a lot. No. The real wise shit is the assistance lift what really improves your lift. And then the competition lift is where you compete in. Okay. That's the claim. The more extreme version of that claim is they'll say, at some point, the core lifts really just don't bring themselves up anymore, and you have to switch to mostly assistance work to do the heavy lifting, pun intended. When you're a beginner, maybe an intermediate, actually practicing squats, bench, and deadlifts will increase them the best. But when you're more advanced, you got to do these really, and oftentimes the selling point is really kind of wonky, strange, dare I say, sort of irrationally creative assistance lifts, which seem to be like an exercise in avoiding the actual hard work of doing the core lifts or avoiding boredom. But in any case, like these are the special assistance lifts that are going to get you these amazing gains. This is how the world champs do it. You'd have to be a dupe to think that you're going to get to world championship level just only or mostly doing the core lifts. And then its most extreme form is the claim that you should do the core lifts very rarely, maybe only in the few weeks leading up to the actual meet itself for powerlifting, and that everything else should be assistance work. This is not a caricature. I can assure you, this is the literal philosophy espoused by variations of the barbell training method, West Side barbell training method. And if you retort with a claim that, well, it's not real West Side because it wasn't done at West Side, this was actually done at West Side Barbell, right? So people do put a lot of stock, as they probably should, because Westside has had a lot of success, into what Westside does and related philosophies, and they will try stuff like this. Like I've seen tons of people do deadlift programs completely bereft of deadlifting until they actually show up and there's a deadlift bar on the ground on the meet day. Okay, 16-week powerlifting cycle of training, no deadlifting to be done until the deadlift or until maybe the last 2 or 3 sessions. Is that the best idea in the world? Is assistance lift work really, really that powerful? Okay, now, assistance lifts to the power lifts are great at about 3 things and 3 categories of things. So they actually do have really good utility. First of all, they're really good on putting on muscle to boost your core lifts. Sometimes better at putting on muscle than the actual lifts themselves, all right? Why? Because they oftentimes have better stimulus to fatigue ratios for hypertrophy than the lifts themselves. So for example, if you do a competition style bench press, wide grip, really big arch, it limits your range of motion, not great for hypertrophy. Also, because you're arching your back the entire time, it really just fatigues the fuck out of your lower back, and you have to go super heavy to get anything out of it because the range of motion is so short. So all of a sudden the stimulus is pretty good, but the fatigue is really gnarly. If you do more flat back benching with just a little bit of retraction or like low incline work, you get a fucking massive hit to your pecs, front delts, triceps, great hypertrophy stimulus, but the fatigue is lower. So the stimulus to fatigue ratio a lot of times of accessory lifts or assistance lifts is in many cases may be better than the core lift. Sounds counterintuitive, but remember the core lifts are strength lifts. They're not hypertrophy lifts. So sometimes this absolutely works. In addition to that, assistance lifts sometimes have a better SFR for what I can call gap filling for the actual core lifts, even in strength, not just hypertrophy. So for example, if you're having, in a bench press, the pop off the chest is great, but you're having real trouble with the lockout. If you just only bench press, you're like, that's it, I just got to bench press. This here doesn't improve your lockout, but it's summing a lot of fatigue. And by the time you get to your lockout, you're pretty tired. So the actual stimulus to fatigue ratio of your lockout work in a full range of motion bench isn't amazing. right? It's kind of like you want to train your sprint for 100 meters, but you always lead in with a mile run and then sprint for 100. Well, if you fucking didn't lead in with a mile run, you'd be better at sprinting 100 meters. You would improve at it more. What the fuck is the mile run for? Just the same way in bench pressing, what you might want to do is do some rack pressing or some pin pressing or some board pressing in which you actually just do the lockout work itself. That's the thing that's missing in your plan, or that's the thing that's missing in your abilities. That's your weak point. Train it directly. Great stimulus to fatigue ratio as far as training lockouts. Doesn't get better than doing the lockout work. Then later, once your lockouts are much better, you go back to full range of motion bench pressing, and oh my God, it's way higher because this was never a problem, but now this is much better. So assistance lifts are absolutely great at targeting specific weak points, oftentimes better than the lifts themselves. And they're really great at building hypertrophy and strength when you need a break from the core lifts. Psychologically, you can only do so many competition-style squats until you just don't fucking ever want to see them again, and that's important. But also important is the fact that if you do competition-style squatting, bench pressing, and deadlifting, you're going to start to pay for it with sort of connective tissue, maybe not injuries, but sort of wear and tear, right? That exact way you do competition squats, your hips are starting to hurt a little bit. If you just switch to hack squats or front squats or high bar or regular close stand squats, then you may get excellent squat progress, but the break itself is what's needed. So for that, the assistance lifts are really, really awesome. However, they can be given too much credit. And in this myth, they absolutely are. So what are their limitations? Well, first of all, sometimes with all the best intentions in the world, they just don't fucking transfer. You may think they should transfer. You may think increasing an assistance lift will boost your core lift, but it just doesn't, right? And even if they do transfer, sometimes it's like a guessing and hoping game of which ones transfer, which ones don't, how much they transfer, and would you be better off just training the core lifts themselves? Here's the thing. The core lifts always transfer. Okay, it's the identity property, A equals A. There's no transfer required. If your low bar squat goes up, your low bar squat went up. Okay, there's no like, did it transfer? Of course, there's no transfer needed. However, if your high bar squat went up, did your low bar squat go up? Well, maybe, usually, but maybe your low bar squat is limited by your posterior chain strength. Like your legs are plenty strong, but in a low bar, remember, you're actually cantilevered a little bit more forward. Your back gets a more horizontal position. And maybe your limiting factor is the posterior chain use of actually rising up and tilting your back backwards. In that case, if that's a really limiting factor, what would increase your low bar squat is low bar squatting for sure. Maybe something like good mornings, stiff-legged deadlifts, some deadlift work even. That could increase your low bar squat, whereas high bar squat would just make your legs stronger. But if they're not the weak point in the chain, your squat might not go up. And that's a very simple transfer. Some people do machine presses, dumbbell, incline, dips, and they expect a bench press to go up. I remember one time I had an example of this. I took my dips and I essentially added like 90 pounds to my dips for like sets of 5 to 10. I was doing like, and this, I think this is on YouTube, I was like 220 pounds and I was doing a set of 10 super deep dips with 135 pounds hanging between my waist. Like, holy fuck. I had zero transfer to the bench press. I was a competitive powerlifter at the time. Nothing. I did dips for like 3 fucking months. And then dick happened. That sucks. There's no problem like that with core lifts, so it's nothing you ever have to worry about. Number 2, in the short term, weeks to months, nothing builds your core lifts like training your core lifts, right? Anatomical adaptations are direct. The way that low bar squats stress your quads is exactly how they need to be stressed to become better at low bar squats. And there's a technical adaptation there that's huge. Practicing a movement makes you better at the movement. So while assistance lifts are all great and all, they have to stand in reverence of the core lifts as still the best, right? Like, they may be great and all, but they always, to some extent, have to play second fiddle. And we can't just pretend that's not a thing and say core lifts are stupid. Assistance lifts, you can build your whole arsenal with them. That's just not true, right? And in number 3, another way to really screw yourself over is a lot of people can progress really well on the assistance lifts, bored of or irritated by, physically, some kind of irritation by the core lifts. So what they end up doing is they just do essentially almost or exclusively assistance lifts. If you're doing this, it has to be done for a very compelling reason. Like you have to be hurt or something like that. A lot of folks will do core lifts with poor fatigue management. Too much load, too much frequency, too much volume, something like that. And what they'll do is they'll start replacing core lifts with assistance lifts. Because the assistance lifts often are less disruptive, less fatiguing, and because they irritate or fatigue slightly different structures than the core lifts, you're essentially using those assistance lifts as fatigue management. It's using variation as a proxy for fatigue management. Good news, it can keep you training. Bad news, the training is no longer specific and you don't get as strong on the core lifts as you could. A better approach would be if you still used mostly core lifts, but you had heavier and light sessions, higher volume, lower volume sessions, and you managed your frequency intelligently and you deloaded when you had to versus when your body's breaking apart. So a lot of times people move away from core lifts completely because they're doing core lifts wrong. They're approaching that whole thing wrong. And to them, it's like obvious that, assistance works better for me. That's mostly because you suck at doing the core lifts. Like, if you're used to eating fettuccine Alfredo pasta, but you fucking suck at making fettuccine Alfredo sauce, then, at some point you're like, I just eat red sauce with ground beef now. And people are like, oh, why? And you're like, I hate fettuccine Alfredo. It's not one of my favorite foods. And someone who can cook in that audience that you're saying that to, they're like, I bet you this motherfucker doesn't know how to cook. Or it actually shows you how to make really good fettuccine Alfredo. Like, oh my God, this is the fucking shit. How the fuck did I ever get away from this? Because you fucking blew dicks at it. Like, a lot of people have that. Their technique will suck on the core lifts, they'll fatigue manage them properly, or they'll just like assistance lifts, like how they make them feel. They get into a groove in which they get stronger. Like you'll see guys posting about this, like, my fucking close grip bench is skyrocketing. Like last couple months, I've been training a lot. Someone's like, how's your regular bench? You're like, well, I haven't trained in a while. Like, good luck. We go back to that point of hopefully it'll transfer. It may not. And like, yeah, it's nice that you're getting a bigger close grip bench, but what the fuck is happening to your actual competition bench? That has to be a concern if you are actually a competitor. So, taking all this together, looks like assistance lifts definitely have their pluses. They definitely have their limitations. How do we approach this to get the best possible sort of training? First of all, use the core lifts when their stimulus to fatigue ratios are the highest for the job. Interestingly enough, for beginners, this will basically be all the time. So if you're designing a beginner powerlifting program, and Boris Shako is very, very good at this kind of stuff, and you can see a lot of his sample programs on the internet. You can buy his book, actually on the RP website. A lot of those programs for beginners is just a ton of squatting, bench pressing, and deadlifting because they're the best for strength and hypertrophy and peaking for beginners. There's no derivation of different specificity paradigms there because they're just so good at everything. And that's totally great. And as a beginner, you want a huge technical base. There's no way to get that other than tons of practice with the core lifts. You guys ever see Russians powerlifting and you're like, how the fuck is this guy's technique identical from the bar to fucking 800 pounds? That's like a common thing about Eastern European lifters. Well, because this motherfucker's been practicing squatting since he was 10, and he's done so many fucking low bar squats, and you're like, what kind of assistance work do you do? And you're like, I don't really do a whole lot. They might do like, I front squat on occasion. Like, man, that sucks. All I'm doing is assistance work, right? There's a way to get that good. It takes a shitload of practice. Point number 2, when assistance lifts have situationally higher stimulus to fatigue ratios, that means they accomplish the task better at a lower or equal amount of fatigue cost, then you use them. But here's the deal, and this isn't written in the slides. They have to earn their keep. If you're doing an assistance lift and someone asks you, hey, you're a competitive powerlifter, right? You're like, of course, don't I look the part? And they're like, why are you doing that? It's not a power lift. You had better have a fucking good answer. Other than like, well, I should really like close grip bench. Or you're like, it helps me with my lockout. And they're like, do you struggle with your lockout? You're like, no, I struggle off the chest. So why the fuck are you doing that? Like, I don't know, right? They have to have situationally better stimulus to fatigue ratios. They have to earn their keep. There has to be a compelling reason to use them. A lot of times that means they're really good at targeting hypertrophy, especially in specific muscles that you are uncharacteristically weaker in your kinetic chain. And or specific strength gaps. So you can use, incline bench to get bigger pecs because your pecs are lagging, or you can use a close grip bench press with a partial range of motion just at the top and lockouts to get your lockout better. Both work, but there has to be reasons for them. That has to be the problem you're fixing. If you don't have that problem, if you just need to be stronger all around and there's no single limiting factor, you're probably better off doing the core lifts and not the assistance lifts. Every now and again, you might want to just go to assistance lifts, or mostly when the core lifts become stale. You do a whole strength phase with mostly core lifts. You do a peaking phase with almost exclusively core lifts. By then, you're fucking burned out of the core lifts and they're really irritating a bunch of structures. You can absolutely do your first phase of hypertrophy training with no core lifts at all. Not because Yeah, they are better at hypertrophy sometimes. The competition lifts, the core lifts can be really good too, but you're just done with them. You need that break. And after 4 or 6 weeks, you come back to the competition, the core lifts, and everything's fresh. It's new. It works. That's a super good reason to use assistance lifts and not core lifts. Point number 3. When you're using a lot of assistance work for overloading purposes, okay, you absolutely can do that. So high bar squats taken higher and higher and higher will absolutely, in most cases, unless you have like a weird limiting factor of just posterior chain or something, which is quite rare, high bar squats will improve your low bar squat. But the best way to do that isn't just to do the high bar squats, but do your heavy work, overloading work with high bar squats, for example, or flat back bench, or whatever it is you're doing that's an assistance lift and not the core lift. Still have the core lift in there, even though you can't or don't want to train it heavy, at least train it light for technique. So while the high bar squats really power your ability to lift weights, right, your core strength, the core lift, the low bar squat competition stance, is still there as a light lift for technique work so that your technique on that doesn't slip off much and actually maybe continues to improve. So when you get into your later phases of the cycle and you have to do heavy core lifting, it's not an alien thing to you. It's much easier to transfer high bar squatting strength to competition squatting strength if you've been doing competition squats light the entire time. You never forgot anything. It's smooth as day. But if you went 8 weeks without touching a low bar squat at all, it's going to be a rough transition. Sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it's short-sighted. Eventually, using all of these things together, your training will look something like this. Your hypertrophy phase will be lots of assistance work, some core work, oftentimes much lighter just for the purposes of maintaining technique, and sometimes no core work at all, especially if it's really irritated. Your strength phase will be lots of core work and some assistance work to fill in the gaps, fill in the strength where, maybe your lockout's not as good, strength off the floor and the deadlift's not as good. You need specific assistance lifts to address those problems. Peaking phase will be almost exclusively core work. When you're up to it, it'll be heavy and hard to make you better. When you're too fucked up, it'll be light and easy to keep your technique going. There's very little place for assistance work in a peaking program because it just isn't justified stimulus to fatigue wise. Why the fuck are we doing that? What is it getting us that is better than core work at the time? And a lot of times the answer is not really. There are some cases in which that actually happens, but then the assistance work is minimally involved. You're not going to have a peaking phase ideally, which is mostly assistance work. That's insane. There has to be a damn good reason for doing that. For active rest, after your peaking phase, 1 to 3 weeks for powerlifting should be taken super easy training or no training at all. You stay the fuck away from core work, assistance work only if you're doing any gym work at all. That's the time when your core work, your squat, your bench and deadlift competition style are the most irritated, the most overreached, the most stale. You can completely get away from them and should to let the joint structures heal back up, to let your mind heal back up and get excited about doing the core lifts again. And then when you enter your next hypertrophy phase, you get into lots of assistance work and potentially some core work. That's the way it should work ideally. No crazy exaggerations, no weird dogmas. Folks, see you next time for the next myth.